How's that?
Yeah, everybody can see.
Okay,
We set it up so that, yeah.
Okay.
You're all visible. Okay, so we are reconvening and Reg is doing what he can to get people in. So one of the key goals that we identified for today's program was to take a look at the current state of what we call key influencers impacting natural resource policies and practices, namely climate change, emerging contaminants, regulatory shifts, and international synergies. So I'd now like to turn it over to Jeff Talbert, who will serve as the moderator of one of three panels today. This one is focused on diverse influences on practice. So Jeff will briefly introduce the four members of the panel. Charlene Thomas will be virtual. The others are here in the room. And facilitate discussion among the panelists, and then we'll engage with the audience, both in person and virtual, time permitting. Jeff is a partner with Arnold & Porter in the New York City office and is an accomplished trial attorney and environmental lawyer who focuses on environmental litigation, permit, and risk management, and his full bio is accessible on our meeting website. I know that among his accolades are major litigation successes when he was working with the Department of Justice. Is that correct? Yes. So take it away, Jeff. We will go up to 12 noon, and then we'll have a break, and I'll talk a couple minutes before we take that break. So here we go.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. So we've got an excellent panel for you today. This is going to be wide-ranging and relatively broad, looking at different issues that impact natural resources. We're going to touch on NRD in the current administration, climate change, emerging contaminants, and also international environmental issues. Rick, as she mentioned earlier in the talk with Roger, we'll talk a little bit about his experience in Ukraine working there. So on the panel, we have Roger Nober, who's the director of the George Washington Regulatory Studies Center. He's a professor of practice of public policy and public administration. He was previously an executive vice president and chief legal officer at BNSF Railway. He was also the chairman of the U.S. Surface Transportation Board and chief counsel of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the U.S. House of Representatives. So welcome. We also have Jay Pendergrass. Jay is the senior attorney and director for the Center of State, Local, and Regional Environmental.
That's a little out of date, so just skip.
Jay has done a ton of work at ELI. He has been involved as the vice president for programs and publications, written extensively on ways to improve implementation of law in the environmental area. And we're excited to have Jay on the panel. All right. Remotely, I think we have Charlene Thomas, who's the senior emerging contaminant program manager at Battelle. She has 26 years of experience in environmental consulting and 18 years of experience supporting PFAS evaluations. She supports state, federal, and industry clients with PFAS evaluations, and she's worked in 32 different states. We also have Rick Wenning. He's the principal at Wenning Environmental. He's worked as a consultant for many years. He is a specialist in as an ecotoxicologist, environmental risk assessment specialist. He works and focuses on characterizing exposure pathways. He's published over 100 papers and was the editor-in-chief of CTAC. He's going to provide an international perspective for our panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Roger Nober.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I would note that in my former life, Arnold & Porter we were clients of Arnold & Porter, working with us on an environmental matter in Montana, which at some point during a break I'll explain to people, but it's kind of an only in a railroad sort of situation involving grizzly bears in our track. So I don't think anyone here probably worked on that, but that was a super interesting experience, and one that's still unresolved after all these years, which I know would not be a shock. So I wanted to just do a little bit of a survey this morning of some of the regulatory changes that are in process. And I didn't really plan it this way when I left the company and thought I would go be a professor. We would just sort of look at, kind of esoteric regulatory issues, because I was somebody who is both a regulator and as a regulated entity focused a lot on the way agencies implemented their regulatory powers to make policy. That was something that, and that's probably what folks who are in practice do every single day, all day, right? Which is work with regulatory agencies to influence their policy, which are really not even regulations. Most of those are adjudications, but that's what I came to do. And then after the election, we've seen that probably the most significant, and over the last summers, with last summer's Supreme Court decisions, and then with this last election, the most significant shift in regulatory philosophy and policy in several decades. And so I just wanted to talk, most of that everybody here is going to be familiar with, so I don't want to reinvent the wheel and just explain things that everybody here probably knows better than me. On the other hand, it really has influenced and changed the way regulations are made, the way they're viewed, and their durability. So why in an environmental setting is this so critical? Because if you looked at the root cause of many of the objections to the expansion of the regulatory state, it would be using longstanding environmental statutes to regulate in areas that they were never intended to do. So using pollution statutes to regulate climate change, for example. And there are a lot of reasons why agencies tried to do that, and there are a lot of reasons why that's been pushed back upon. But if you look back, it's been that tension that I think has led to really the expansion of the regulatory state and then the contraction of it that we're seeing in recent years. So the first, I'd say, theme that we're seeing is there's a real desire for agencies to stay within the lanes of the statutes in which they're implementing. And the place that comes significantly out in is in environmental statutes in general and climate change in particular. And this administration has had no shortage of zeal, I would say, to rein in the administrative state, which, depending on your point of view, is either an insult or a compliment. It depends. Different people view it different ways. And they've really taken an interesting approach, which is to focus on executive orders and use executive orders to deregulate and to aim to deregulate and then to change the direction of the regulatory state. Now, just stepping back, if you're a regulatory lawyer, which probably everybody in the room is some form of, you know that it's axiomatic that the only way a government can undo an action is to follow the exact same procedure it used to do the action. And that's pretty much been black letter law since the passage of the Administrative Procedure Act back in 1946. But this administration is sort of viewing that in a different lens and has put forward a number of actions to perhaps try to truncate that. And the jury will, no pun intended, but in a legal audience, you can say the jury is out on whether that will really work in the long run. So two EOs that I wanted to focus on, and the first I focus on is the one on independent agencies, 14215, because I was the chairman of an independent agency and worked to create one when I was the lead House staffer on the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. And the administration, I think, really has taken of two minds to this. The first is that they are of the belief that any political appointee is answerable to the White House and that Congress doesn't have the power to create administrators with a term or board members with a term of years that would serve out beyond administration. And so they're actively trying to bring that legal case to a head. For any of you who ever thought that you would be an expert in a case called Humphrey's Executor, you probably were like, oh my gosh, that was one of those 19th century legal cases that we didn't pay any attention to. It's just now become probably the critical issue in administrative law. But the executive order itself that I'm referring to, 14215, doesn't address the term of board members. It's actually intended to change the behavior of and coerce the chairman. And with a very few exceptions, most chairs of independent agencies serve at the pleasure of the president. He can designate another person as chair if he wants to. And this puts restrictions on what the chair can and can't do. And whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. They were very, very savvy and understood the structure of regulatory agencies. And while there have been a lot of concerns about some of the executive orders, nobody has actually challenged the right of the agency to direct chairmen and have chairmen be accountable to them. So it's interesting how that one's gone. The second one is 14219, which directs the repeal of unlawful regulations. And this is the one that said that every agency, independent and otherwise, is supposed to look at every regulation. And it listed 10 Supreme Court cases, three of them from last summer. And if the agency determines that any of those are exceeding what the Supreme Court said was permissible, they should bring that to the attention of the Attorney General. The Attorney General would make their own independent evaluation, and then they would be terminated on an expedited regulatory process without notice and comment for good cause shown as being violative of the Supreme Court. And that's one where I've been asked in the media a lot. There's been a lot of questions, and really many of the targets of this are environmental regulations, which many of you probably deal with. And if you had asked me, could you repeal regulations in this manner, I would have come back to say, well, what I would tell anybody is that you can only repeal something the same way that you promulgated it, and following the same process. So this has not been used yet in any meaningful way, and we will see how this plays out, but it does have the potential to cause a great deal of uncertainty for regulated entities as to whether or not the regulations that are still on the books but are not being enforced can whether they apply to them. And the only answer I've given to that is that if you're a company, you generally have a code of conduct that says you are going to abide by all pertinent federal, state, and local rules and regulations. And if a regulation is on the books but not being enforced, you still have to comply with it, or at least that would be my advice to our board of directors, which is that you still have to comply with it. It'd be like saying, well, if the District of Columbia says we're not going to enforce the speed limit on Connecticut Avenue, but it's posted at 30 and you go 75 and have an accident, you're not going to be able to say, well, that was fine because they weren't going to enforce the speed limit. You'd still be liable for negligence. So I have my doubts as to whether or not this will work, but it's a fascinating question to be able to watch and see from a distance. So the final thing I'll mention, and I think I've gone on for longer than I should have, I'm a professor now, so I get to do that, is that what's happening with personnel, and that a lot of agents, you've seen all of the layoffs, all the rifts, all the different changes to the federal personnel. And I'm agnostic as to whether any individual person should have to leave, whether their job is needed or not. I think any of you that deal with the federal government might even, no matter what your political persuasion is, might say, some behavior change in the federal bureaucracy wouldn't be all bad, right? That people were more accountable and move faster. That wouldn't be a terrible thing. That said, if you have to follow the same process to deregulate that you used to regulate, then you're ultimately going to need people to do it. And if the goal is lasting deregulation, something that is not just, that's not just going to exist for the 4 years of this administration and then be turned around by whatever the next one is, then you need to follow administrative process, and you're going to need people to do that. So a number of stakeholders have been quietly wondering are we going to have enough people to do the kind of job we want to do and avoid the regulatory whiplash back and forth that you see between administrations. And in no place is that more prevalent than in the environmental area. And the final thing, I'll just make a personal pitch, which is that I think if this administration is able to stop technology forcing regulations, particularly on the environmental side, that's probably a good thing, because I can tell you as when private companies are looking at investment, regulatory uncertainty is a deterrent to investing in new technology. And much as people might like to see regulatory requirements to bring the best available technology be consistently updated, it has the perverse effect of deterring investment in the first place, because nobody knows. I mean, are you going to replace your washing machine if you think the new one you buy is going to have to be replaced 3 years after that? Of course not. You'll use the one you have until it breaks. So with that, I've gone on for longer than I should, but it's a fascinating time to watch things. And, you know, as I said, I could have spoken the entire hour and a half on these subjects. So again, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Roger. And we will have a time for questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jay now to talk about climate change.
Thank you. And was asked to do an overview of climate change as an influencer and effects, and you know, using sort of a comparison to 5 years ago. So my talk is what Roger said, right? I mean, he just talked about, you know, a lot of what he's talking about was climate change and the change in corporate perspective. So that's the first part. What I was going to cover is that it has become mainstream, particularly over the last 5 years, whether you're looking at what corporations are seeing as important, what's in the news, what NGOs, I'm with the Environmental Law Institute, you know, what it is that we're doing. Climate change is very definitely the major environmental issue. You know, I know anecdotal evidence is not evidence, but I've just had 2 pretty close encounters with climate change. I was on vacation in Paris 3 weeks ago, and whole idea was to enjoy walking around the Latin Quarter and the Seine and everything, except that it was 103 and 105 degrees on the 2 days that I had to wander. And Paris restaurants aren't air conditioned, and the museums are. So got to spend a lot of quality time in some great museums. But the buses aren't air conditioned either. So it's a whole different, you know, the way the cities have been set up wasn't taking into account the current literal climate. And I live in Silver Spring, and my watershed is Sligo Creek, which had the worst flood ever on Friday because the moisture in the air has been so high for so long that when we had a thunderstorm, we had 5 inches or more than 5 inches in 2 hours, and the whole watershed was saturated because of prior rains. Anyway, it is dramatically affecting people. So just an example, I am a member of the Greenhouse Gas Verification, Validation, Accreditation Committee. It's a bureaucratic a thing as you could think about, except that it is part of the private sector accountability mechanism for companies that are trying to account for their emissions, reduce their emissions, get credit for projects. And 5 years ago, there were questions of how relevant the GVAC was, whether there was going to continue to be it, because the accreditation committee accredits those firms that are then going to companies and verifying their emissions, validating what they're doing. And the number of companies seeking accreditation was going down. And now 5 years later, they're going up. More of the conformity assessment groups are wanting to get into this business. It's not necessarily coming from U.S. corporations. It's coming from Asia. But this is something that, the accountability mechanism for greenhouse gas emissions reductions is actually something that's a global concern. And, I can see it in a particular way. Also, the largest project that the Environmental Law Institute has had for the past 5 years is climate change. It's specifically something we call the Climate Judiciary Project, which is to educate judges about climate change. And the Environmental Law Institute, if you aren't familiar with it, we are also a multi-sector organization where we are education, publishing, and research. But what we respond to needs and questions. And so this is something that judges are actually very interested in learning about climate and climate science, to the point where the Federal Judicial Center, organizing education for federal judges, and the state education organizations for judges are all interested in it, and actually asking for more information about it. It's been very interesting to note that judges, including bankruptcy judges, want to know about climate science because they're seeing it not in those few cases that get in the news as the climate change cases, but rather in the normal work that judges do where climate change becomes an issue or they have to deal with it to some degree. Then the other point that I wanted to make, it also goes to what Roger was talking about, is that the electrification of the grid, it's now very commonplace that renewables are what is being put onto the grid. It's not to say, we still know that China and India are still building more fossil fuel plants, and some other countries as well, but renewables are continuing to expand, and notably are still a part of this administration's what they call it, I think it's energy dominance, but though they don't specifically refer to them as renewables, when you look at it, geothermal is there, hydro is there, so it's not explicitly on all of, but they haven't cut out the greenhouse gas neutral kinds of sources. So with that, just as a bit of a personalized overview, I guess, to some degree, we'll let the others, and happy to talk about questions.
Pass it over to Shalene remotely to talk about our favorite emerging contaminant, PFAS.
Hi there. Can you see me and hear me? I do not want to be larger than life. I'm just going to put myself back on, stop my video. But Tara, if you could put up the couple of slides for the group. Thanks, Barbara, for allowing me to participate virtually, and appreciate the opportunity, Jeff, to be on the panel. So
Just give us a
I'm
sec
covering
to set it
emerging
up.
chemicals. Do you have it
Charlene,
set up
just give
yet?
us
Okay.
just give us a minute to set it up. Yeah.
Yeah. So as you do that, I'll just talk quickly about the 3 slides that I'm going to talk through for illustrative purposes since I'm not there today. So first I was going to cover and have just 3 simple graphics. One to talk about the current status of chemical pollution in general. Barbara's asked us to be very high level. Hopefully this is not too high level for everybody, but I will take it down a couple notches from here. Then I'll look more specifically at emerging chemicals from a near term and longer term forecast. And then finally, future casting, where I think this is going from a solutions-based perspective. So not starting too high up in the stratosphere with chemical pollution in general and where we stand, what you're looking at here is a graphic of the planetary boundaries framework. If you haven't seen this before, I do like following it. It's interesting to watch every handful of years when they update it. It was first developed in 2009 by 28 different internationally renowned scientists to highlight a framework of 9 different global change processes where human activities are going to affect the Earth system's functioning. So the intention is to look very, very broadly at these planetary boundaries, which are quantitative assessments of the safe limits for human pressure. So where are they going to crack up against the human pressure? You can see 9 different critical areas. Climate was just spoken about. The one that we're focusing on right now is novel entities, and that specifically is chemical pollution. So in 2009, when this first came out, only 3 had actually crossed the planetary boundary. By 2015, 4 had crossed the planetary boundary. And by 2023, 6 have crossed the planetary boundary. And that does include novel entities and specifically chemical pollution. So if you read any literature on this, you know, chemical pollution in general has been defined as really an existential threat. I think that's that theme you see throughout everything we work on in the environmental industry, and the awareness now past just environmental scientists and those that work in the industry, but broader knowledge, awareness, and concern down to the public level. So what really does it mean to cross planetary boundary? It's increasing the risk, generating a large scale, either abrupt or irreversible environmental change. So the impacts really will not necessarily be immediate or drastic, but together the boundaries mark a critical threshold for risk to society and the biosphere that we are currently a part of. So what does this mean in the context of natural resources? You know, pollutants may trigger the sudden and dramatic ecological changes, as we all know, pushing the ecosystem past the point of no return. So I thought this was a good starting point. We see many emerging chemicals front and center of the chemical pollution, part of the existential threat, whether real or perceived, and the amount of synthetic substances such as PFAS, microplastics, and the like released into the environment with adequate safety testing is really pushing some of this into the high risk zone. So that's my first point. You can move to the next slide. I want to take a step down from that helicopter stratosphere view. I really love this graphic. The reference there is below from a finance and emerging chemicals discussion. What you're looking at here, and now that we know chemical pollution is an existential threat, where do we stand on emerging chemicals of concern? When we say emerging chemicals of concern, it's a bit of a misnomer because emerging implies that this is something new and forward thinking, but really it's a retrospective reactive principle upon which we're reacting to chemicals that have been released into the environment. So the reason I really love this graphic is that it showcases, you know, in 2020, you're looking at the market share of chemicals of concern, emerging chemicals, versus the forward look and hopefully a shared goal to transition to green and sustainable chemistry. This is going to be a difficult transition. Many have already started, but I feel like this illustrates where we want to go and where we can have that impact on that potential existential threat as a planetary boundary of chemical pollution. So when I talk about emerging chemicals, of course, I'm talking about those that are defined as real or perceived risk to human health and the environment. They have no regulation or have not been fully regulated, or they have new or evolving science. The graphic is an outcome of the Sustainable Chemistry Catalyst and Investor Environmental Health Network. I love this project because it does a lot similar to what Roger was saying of, you know, having industry drivers for change from a sustainability perspective, but also look at it along the whole life cycle of any product, any manufacturing setting, any industry, where you need to look across the entire supply chain. And if you're making a green or sustainable chemistry shift, it's not just at one corporate, one manufacturer, a single company level. It really has to be bought in and supported across the entire life cycle of that chemical's use all the way through to product. So this is one of the very reasons that I like this graphic. So now that you know we have this existential threat, chemical pollution, none of you are surprised by that. I think the next picture really showing that we want to push from a chemical of concern, sort of that reactionary approach to more of a precautionary principle, proving chemical safety before its use, so that we're moving more in a green and sustainable way. And you can move to the last slide. So again, future casting, I think this came up as well a bit earlier, from a circular economy perspective. So obviously resource use is improvised by minimizing the extraction of natural resources, maximizing your waste prevention, and then optimizing environmental, social, material, and economic values through the life cycle. So back to that life cycle that I mentioned. I'm seeing this in several different areas that I work in. So if you take as an example PFAS, you know, you have primary manufacturers changing course, some from exiting entirely out of the fluorochemistry business like 3M, some like ScienceCo that are moving to more of a circular approach. And their circular approach is by necessity, because there are many essential users out there that still need PFAS, at least in the near term being, you know, 10 plus years, semiconductors, medical device, and the like. I'm also seeing substantial variability around drivers in this area. You know, so why are companies moving into this circular direction? If you look again back at PFAS, the drivers are many. So obsolescence. So they maybe received chemicals from 3M as an example. They're no longer being made. They're no longer being served in the market. They have to shift. Supply chain pressures. We're seeing many companies pushing up or down the supply chain saying, we are not going to purchase from you if you have an emerging chemical such as PFAS in your product. As well as consumer and public pressure, going back to the existential threat and the fact that there's so many more people now that have that understanding, concern for the environment is causing movement up and down that supply chain. And lastly, I would say insurance and business practices. So insurance companies are also requiring evidence that you are not using that emerging chemical. So these are all trends that I think are new and different as we move forward into more of a solution-based circular economy. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you. Rick, can you talk a little bit about international influences?
I will. Yeah, thank you all. Jeff and Barbara, thank you for having me. So I will,
You have to turn it off.
a little bit of an insight. I call myself a science mechanic. So I'm not so smart about law, and some of this stuff on philosophy of the environment is great, but I'm the guy you might call if you're trying to figure out a risk assessment, or you're looking at a risk assessment and wondering, is it covering all the bases? Or is the science up to date? Are there things that should or shouldn't be done? So I consider myself a science mechanic. And in that regard, I've been fortunate in my career to work in a lot of places around the world. In the 90s, I was in Sydney, Australia for a few years, thinking about dioxins and sediments for the 2000 Olympics. I happened to be working with a group at the time that knew a lot about dioxins, and risk assessment was a new thing, kind of. So do that risk assessment thing and help figure out how we're going to clean up for the Olympics so we can have our water venues. Jump a few years later, and I've had the opportunity to work in Brazil after a very large dam failure that affected 500 kilometers of river in Brazil, all the way to the ocean, affecting communities that were developed and underdeveloped and indigenous all along the way. And the public ministry, the Brazilian judicial entity, really wanted to know not only how we were cleaning up that stretch of river, but some of the social well-being implications, right? How are we dealing with biodiversity loss, this new concept in the 2015s? How are we dealing with issues around indigenous rights and what was lost to those communities relative to the damages were done? And then more recently, a couple of great examples that draw my thoughts on where we are in this crystal ball of today and tomorrow is Ukraine. Ukraine has a set of damage assessment methodologies, very rudimentary. I'm really proud to say that I don't do any of this without Ted Tomasi and his team at Integral, because Ted gives the economics perspective that is essential in the damage assessment framework. I'm the mechanic, right? I'll pick up the hammer and the screw, and Ted sometimes will tell me what the right sizes are for some of these things that we're doing. But we engaged with that group to help them fill out this process of damage assessment to incorporate these concepts of biodiversity, social well-being, climate change. In Ukraine, of course, the reconstruction of that country when that day comes is going not just to restore the environment to where it was. Nobody can do that anymore in the current guise of climate change, but to take it to a new green future. And what is that green future? And as a science mechanic, what are those metrics of that green future that we need to be mindful of, or maybe more mindful than we have in the past? A last example, I'm working with a group along the southern shores of Lake Ontario, where recontamination of an old problem, DDT, is come back as we build out farmland to residential and unlock soils that were locked for ages with maybe some old habits in terms of pesticide use. So how does the science today differ from yesterday? What are we not thinking about today that they were really freaked out about yesterday, or vice versa? What were we freaked out about yesterday about DDT and the environment and its effect on fishes and bird life and human health? And maybe we've learned a lot today and we don't need to be quite so fussed about. Those are big questions. And this transformative future that I see in my teeny weeny part of the world in Maine, with these kinds of experiences, is there is a confluence of science and technology and law. We heard Roger today talk about this collaborative, transparent nature of how the world might be proceeding. I definitely see that in different places. Whether it's the work in Brazil, whether it's my work that I do in Israel, whether it's the stuff that Ted and I do in Ukraine, parties on different sides of the equation, of the challenge, are more likely than not trying to work together with that added spice of, and how are you handling biodiversity in addition to an environmental quality criteria that you need to satisfy? How are you thinking about climate change? If we're going to rebuild forests in 20 years' time, will those forests still be there? Those kinds of questions. So I think this transformation of us versus them is grounded in issues around the need for a science mechanic like myself and others that are certainly here in the room, to be far more transparent, far more cognizant of international agreements, international treaties. And as I think about some of these things, I don't necessarily see that necessarily happening in the US as I think from my broader international perspective. I find that when I'm asked to look at a document, when I'm asked to look at a situation, the very first thing a question I almost invariably get is, so what's the American experience like on this? How did you all handle this kind of thing? And that's a fair question because here in the US, right, our problems generally have tended to be bigger, more elaborate, maybe more noisy than they have been in other parts of the world. And there's a real interest in the mechanics of how we have solved problems, how we've linked assessment methods to technological solutions. And that's a very interesting question that I get asked a lot. How did you get from point A to point B? What data did you collect? And what data did you apply to create a solution? And is that solution, did it work? But there are a couple of things that I think that are more sensitive than what I have necessarily been attuned to in the past. And that is the question surrounding some of these themes we've heard today. So how do you address sustainability in terms of this remediation of this restoration work? How is that addressed in your risk assessment? Should I be worried about saving the wolves, or am I more interested in reducing carbon dioxide in the environment in my project? And one tool that has become very important to me is environmental benefits analysis. And when Ukraine approached and said, you know, we'd like to be a little bit more elaborate with our damage assessment methodologies, damages in forests, damages to water quality, damages to farmland, methodologies for each of these sectors, it was real obvious that we needed an economic analysis, a cost-benefit perspective to be able to help answer those questions. Because I could chase down the biodiversity consequences in a damage assessment to the umpteenth degree. I could chase down to the umpteenth degree the climate challenges that might be posed by a restoration. But which one was more important? What would give me the best result for the dollars that were going to be invested in remediation today and remediation tomorrow in a future environment? If Ukraine, for instance, ponders a green, resilient future, if Brazil is looking to restore 500 kilometers of physically impacted waterway and return social well-being and a livelihood to the population along that river, it's more than just chemistry, right? And I think, my last thought on this is when I was in Vienna in May, and I had the opportunity to meet with the director of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, their environmental person. And, you know, things were kind of fussed in the news about what was happening in the US. And I said, you know, I'm an American guy, I'm a consultant, 2 strikes. And 3, I'm in Maine, I'm in a little corner of the world. Do you think I have some value in terms of the issues that you're dealing with in Europe and Ukraine and elsewhere? Oh, absolutely, the director said, because the American experience is just that. It's deep, it's varied, it has a very large science bench, and that science bench will, regardless of where we are today, is going to be around for a while. And that expertise is lacking in some parts of the world. And the director said, we have very smart and capable people in different parts of the world. They know guidance. We've got culturally sensitive, regionally focused, environmentally clear regulations emerging in different parts of the world, in different countries within the member states, for instance. What we lack is practical experience. And what we lack are fundamental paradigms that help us evaluate A versus B. How do we get the best of a little bit of a spice of biodiversity with a spice of climate change, with a dose of sustainability in the context of restoring the environment, of resource management into the future in terms of remediation, more than just achieving an environmental quality goal and dredging, digging, burying, capping, or whatever. And the last thing that director said to me, she goes, but unlike perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, when y'all, Americans, were kind of leading the pack in many aspects of environmental work, everybody else has been raising their game. And in fact, in many cases, what I have found, and the director said, that On issues about biodiversity applied to resource management and climate change and you might be a little behind the curve in the US these days, right? Some of those concerns in other places in the world have got a very large seat at the table. And that's where I find in the work that I do internationally, I have to do a lot of homework. I have to become a lot more sensitive about what's going on in different places in the world. I really have to be thinking about international treaties and organizations and what that group of people are saying about the plight of the world and where we need to head. It's not always available or not always obvious when you're dealing with, a contaminated site cleanup in somewhere, or a pipeline spill in the middle of Kansas. These issues of environmental contamination and restoration and resource management in the future are going to require, I dare say, someone who's a lot smarter than just an ecotoxicology trained person from the 1980s, right? It's going to take a village of technologists, law, government, and different scientists and engineers, maybe engineers, applied in a collaborative fashion to problem solve. And I do see that in a lot of places in the world. I see evidence, Barbara, maybe of that happening here in the US for sure. But, we've got all these winds blowing in different directions, so it's hard to see where it's all going. But the tide in the future of environmental work that I see in resource management is definitely collaborative, transparent, and very broad-based.
Thanks, Rick. We're going to open it up for any questions that people may have. Then I have some. Yep. Yeah, I mean, we can do that first. So,
Anyone online who wants to ask a question, if you could go into the chat function. But I think there'll be some discussion among the panelists, and then open it up for in room and on web.
all right, so the first question topic for the full panel, we'll start with Rick. Is since the change in the administration, have you seen that change impact your area of focus? And yours is obviously international. You've just said that, the US has been looked at as a leader in many areas. Have you seen anything change in your international work? And then I know, Roger, you touched on a lot of just observations, but we'll see if you have any take on that as well. So go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, just a quick observation. Number one, my fellow science mechanics in different parts of the world are freaking out with and very sympathetic to what they perceive as a very negative development in the US, right? But aside from that, no, I'd say, and it's not like I'm getting a bazillion calls since January, but the general attitude among the clients that I do talk to and the folks that I do talk to, basically say this too shall pass. Now, whether it's good or bad, I don't want to get into any of that stuff. But the American experience, I have the impression from talking to friends overseas is a bit like the tides. They kind of goes ups and downs, and there's some shifts and changes, but there's a general direction that everything is headed in. And I don't think there's been any concern about that.
Okay. Roger.
If I can make my microphone work. All right, first of all, I want to apologize for looking at my phone. My flight was been delayed 3 hours from the time that Rick started talking to the time he finished. So, we're all excited about American Airlines and how they've handled that. So I was trying to address it, but we shall see. I think that this administration has come in and has really sought to change the direction on a lot of environmental policy. And I think that those who, I heard a lot of the words being used today, existential threat and, and all the other kinds of things, that people who really believe that climate change and environmental problems are the single biggest issue that society faces should ask themselves, why is why are the efforts that have been made being reversed? And is pushing to use statutes and statutory authority that weren't really intended to to address the issues that are being done, the best way to see long-term lasting change, as opposed to this whiplash that's back and forth. So I think that and actually it's interesting, many of the progressive NGOs have come to my center and come to me and said, why is this happening? Why is there such antipathy? And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think, but I think that it starts with, while individuals feel, and a certain strata may feel really, 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 really strongly that this is the number one issue, I don't think that there is as great a societal consensus in that. And so, as you said, generally, like the tide, going in the right direction is probably a better way to make long-term progress. And this administration has probably undone everything that was done in the last administration. And is that really, if the goal is to see environmental improvements and change and reduction in greenhouse gases, is that the best way to do it? So I think that there really has been a receptive audience to these changes. And I think that's part and parcel of using and pushing so hard in the prior two Democratic administrations.
Thanks. Shalene?
Shailene, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Good point so far. I feel like from an emerging chemicals perspective, at the federal level, we obviously see deregulation, but I don't see it necessarily as deregulation, but rather refocusing from the emerging chemicals perspective. Focusing on drinking water, which is a primary exposure route for PFAS as an example. Haven't really moved much forward in the other microplastics and other chemicals of concern. But as a result of that, we definitely see substantial movement at the state level. States, to my second slide, still really focused on, chemicals of concern, emerging chemicals, versus thinking more in a green and sustainable way. They have to do less with more, and that's where their head is at right now. From a global perspective, I see still a lot of movement, fast and furious forward, whether it's the European Union with the REACH restriction proposal, or countries like Canada, Japan, that are still moving forward with emerging chemicals regulations.
Thanks. Jay?
So I also had the opportunity to do a fair amount of work in other countries over the past couple of decades. And I think, Rick, I have a lot of the same perspective on climate change specifically. It's still, people do look to the US, but they've gotten away from what I saw in the 90s and maybe early 2000s of actually really wanting to take the regulatory or legal perspectives and adopt the laws or whatever, but more the general concepts. And certainly with climate change, the international regime continues on, whether Trump withdraws us from Paris and Biden puts us back in, and Trump withdraws us from Paris. That's largely irrelevant to what is really being done at the do you call it the screwdriver and the hammer kinds of things that are being done. And as Roger was talking about, this has become something that's, at least with major corporations, it's something that whether or not there's going to be an SEC rule, companies are making themselves accountable by putting out their own reports and inviting people to question them about it.
Thanks, Jay. All right, we're going to stay with you first and then move through the panel. But next question is, what are the biggest challenges facing companies and government leadership relative to these influences?
Well, I do think there's an issue of so we've talked, politically about the pendulum swings with different administrations, and maybe it's gotten that the swings are so big that it's a bit more of whiplash. But for companies to be able to figure out how to deal with government when there's big changes in regulatory philosophy, and maybe it's taking Roger's advice of continue to comply with the law, whether or not you think these regulations are going to be in place, but to move ahead with the say voluntary or their own goals, and to stick to that in terms of continuing to make progress.
Shalene, same question to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think for companies from an emerging chemicals perspective, it's really trying to manage, mitigate, and eliminate liability associated with litigation and brand risk. Litigation is still moving forward in this country, despite maybe a lull in the federal regulations associated with some of the emerging chemicals. So I think from a company or industry perspective, that's where they have to focus, is how they're still going to protect from any type of environmental liability, litigation risk, and brand risk. For the government, I think it's more challenging right now with the recent, I think just last Friday, announcement that the Office of Research and Development under the EPA would cease to operate. I think their intention is to pull some of those employees into other parts of the EPA. But whatever form or fashion it is in, it was really the scientific backbone, I think, of the EPA in a lot of ways. So it's a change. Does it mean it's necessarily going away? I don't know. I doubt it. But the form or fashion that it's in is going to be a challenge. It might be a blip in the radar in terms of consistent delivery.
Roger, you have a corporate background. From your perspective, what are the biggest challenges companies face right now?
Well, I think you have to separate, kind of the professional services world, which, change in regulatory activity is good for them, versus the industrial world, which is investing capital and moving forward. So from that world, which is what I was from, I think uncertainty and regulatory whiplash become a disincentive to investment. And if the goal is to see environmental improvements, then a consistent regulatory framework that's durable and transparent is really what the companies are seeking. And when I teach regulation now, I spend a lot of time telling the students, I said, you may think that big business doesn't like regulation, and you would be wrong. And for many companies, regulatory activity is what our old owner Warren Buffett used to call a moat, meaning that only the largest and best capitalized players can comply with regulatory structures and strictures, the same people that hired the people who, work at Arnold and Porter. So their interest in regulation is they have an interest in regulation. It's in a certain type of regulation and a certain kind of regulation. So, I do think that I use as an example the pandemic. If you look at the health and safety restrictions that went into the pandemic, who benefited from that, right? The Amazons, Walmarts, Targets, Domino's, McDonald's of the world grew, and a third of all independent restaurants and stores went out of business. And so size and scale and the capital and the wherewithal for compliance, and then for for both compliance and for meeting and investing in strictures become a competitive advantage. So that's a little bit off topic, but I would say for companies, it all depends on who you're talking about. But for large companies, I mean, clearly regulatory stability is what's sought. For smaller ones, you want to have regulations that aren't so stringent and so unmeetable that they just decide to ignore them because they can't meet them, so why even try?
Rick, I guess same question to you, but with obviously your international experience and the governments you're dealing with internationally.
Yeah, it comes down to just matching goals and objectives with metrics. So governments, regulatory agencies, just like companies, have hopes and dreams for the future, right? Green futures and biodiverse and blue, blue, blue. But what has been lacking on both sides of the equation, companies and governments, is the metrics that meaningfully define that we are reaching or striving towards those goals and objectives, right? Good example in the European Union is the Water Framework Directive, right? That's been out for a while, and a goal is for to achieve good ecological status in waterways. Well, what is that? You know, what exactly do I need to measure that I can qualify for GES? And that might differ in Denmark relative to Italy. So we have to be a little bit more cognizant of local flavors for sure. And in the world of impact assessment, I'm involved right now with companies that are interested in marine carbon dioxide removal. You know, we're going to reverse climate change by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and capturing it in the marine environment. Great idea. An environmental impact assessment to try and demonstrate what the consequences of those additives or whatever the technologies that you're applying to do so, they need to be meaningful and precise and useful to understand whether there's an impact or not. So I think it's the world of metrics. We talk in concepts, and like I said, I'm a science mechanic. So, I mean, I got to touch it and feel it, right? I don't want to think about it because I'm a mechanic. But you got that one, right?
Thanks, Rick. All right, let's open it up for any questions that people may have for the panel.
Okay, John. I saw your eyes perk up when the term engineer was mentioned a few minutes ago.
Is this on? Shalene, her first slide had 9 areas of concern. And if I'm interpreting that slide properly, she said climate change is number 8 of 9 on the list. So Jay, how do you respond to that?
Climate change is a multiplier effect for all of them. I mean, I think that you can see each of them as being, you know, really critical things, but climate change affects just about everything. And we don't necessarily know, you know, in some cases, you know, effects may be positive, some more we think are going to be negative, but I do think it's one that crosses most of them. So shouldn't be, you know, we can deal with it as a single issue, but also have to think about it when we're dealing with other issues.
Question from our friend from Inside EPA. Go ahead.
Hi there, I'm Pavitra from Inside EPA. I had a question also for Shailene. You mentioned in the context of emerging contaminants, although we're seeing deregulation be prioritized at the federal level, it might be more of a refocusing rather than deregulation. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit about that, maybe what you're seeing this new administration focus on differently than the previous administration.
Sure. So I think front and center on the Safe Drinking Water Act, they had passed previously to this administration, PFOS and PFOA with maximum contaminant levels, and then 4 additional that were the sum based on a hazard index. I think refocusing, dropping the hazard index is one example of something that's changed and refocusing. And I think that results in looking at the biggest challenges within the drinking water system. The most hazardous chemicals that are there, the PFAS, PFOA, and focusing on treatment and feasibility of working towards reducing those specifically. So there are some good things, although many people feel quite the contrary. I think focusing on those two chemicals is actually progressive and helpful. So that's one example.
I just had a follow-up, I guess, for Shalene on, you mentioned sustainable chemistry as, you know, kind of an area to move into and focus on. Can you just define that? And then, you know, I think there is a little bit of worry, you know, there's the next chemical that's developed as a replacement for, you know, yeah, PFAS and other chemicals. Obviously, in each of the heydays, people thought that, you know, PCBs were fantastic, right? The reasons they worked. So, can you speak a little bit about that? What principles could be put in place to ensure that you're in fact replacing certain chemicals with a, you know, quote unquote, sustainable chemistry principle?
Certainly. One good organization that's driving a lot of this is Change Chemistry. Patel's a member of Change Chemistry, and what they thrive on is doing, like I said, more of a life cycle assessment analysis. And you see some of these similar type tools used in the European Union when they're doing REACH restrictions, as an example, doing feasibility, economic feasibility for replacement. So in that life cycle assessment, they more proactively look at the chemical alternatives as well as the chemical themselves to determine what the potential risks to human health and the environment are. And that allows, I think, more eyes wide open moving forward for emerging chemicals in understanding that risk reward trade-off. I'm sure Rick can talk at length to this, but firefighting foam, or AFFF, is an example, well-known firefighting agent, works exceptionally well, used everywhere and everything for fires. Class B fires contain PFAS. The alternatives, the fluorine-free foams that are now being used and pushed to market, which have been out in the marketplace in some regards since the early 2000s, have a tendency, some of them, to be more acutely toxic. So it does become a trade-off, but I think the value here is doing the life cycle assessment so that you can, eyes wide open, look at the chemical, look at the alternative, and see if you're willing to move forward with that trade-off, and then you can manage and mitigate it accordingly.
Rick, anything to add?
No, I think she's right. I think Shalene's right. And in that regard, it comes down to transparency, right? There are very, very cumbersome and complex life cycle assessments, and there are very, very simple and brief ones. So if you're trying to make an argument with regard to the efficacy of a substance or materials, if you're trying to weigh one material versus another, perhaps a life cycle assessment is a great way to go to begin to understand the life history of that materials from start to finish. The decision is in the details, right? Just how, at what nitty-gritty level do you need to get to satisfy the different stakeholders that we're making the best choice? That's all I did.
One more quick question, Bill. We're gonna.
How do you build into that process and these life cycle processes exposure pathways? I mean, when you look at PFAS and you talk about firefighting foam, obviously you're applying the foam, directly to the environment. It was concentrated with PFAS. They trained with it every day. And there was never an effort to really look at the exposure pathways. We hear a lot about the value of this chemistry, and I don't know that that's even debatable. The chemistry is fabulous, but keep it in the product, keep it in the industrial uses, and keep it out of the water would be the goal. And that seems to be the missing component with a lot of the discussions about toxicity of chemistry. The issue really is, how do you manage it and keep it out of the water?
Any comment on that, Shalene, before we?
Can you
Go
repeat
to
the last
lunch.
bit? He trailed off. I couldn't hear very well.
I was just asking if, I mean, where do you build in exposure pathway analysis into risk
Yes.
assessment? Because I don't think
Thank
that
you.
there's, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, 100% agree. So unfortunately, the train has left the station in many regards. Not all PFAS, as an example, is created equally. And what we're seeing is the risk is equal to the hazard, and there's no exposure in that equation at all. So I think it's, you know, on people like myself and Rick, those that are on that risk assessment side, to ensure that we have exposure assessment in that life cycle assessment, because I think risk is misperceived in a lot of ways. And Rick, I don't know, you may have something to add.
I was just going to add relatedly, I mean, what about weaving in the concept in the life cycle analysis of how you treat or remove the chemical if there were an exposure, it does get into water, right? Like something, I mean, we deal with different hazardous substances in the environment, some of which are, you know, break down more readily than others.
Well, thank you.
I do definitely agree with
oh,
that.
sorry.
That is in the European approach. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
I think that wraps up our panel.
I think we're wrapping it.
Hitting the knot for me.
Trying to stay on schedule. So excellent panel, excellent staging of, you know, where we're going from here. We've covered some of the really mega scale influences that are germane to, you know, starting with the global, the view from Olympus, as one of my clients used to call it, and then going to some of the pragmatic influences of this panel. And after lunch, we'll hear from John Cruden for a little while. I'll introduce John at 12:45 Eastern. And then we'll have two more panels. The next one, the lay of the land, what is actually happening. And then the third one, how do we work together to get where we want to go, and how do we define that? So lunch hopefully should be out